Hello and a very warm welcome to Money Control, our pre-budget economists roundtable. This is probably one of the toughest budgets for the Modi government, the first full budget after it was voted to power for the third time. And it comes at a time when, besides global uncertainty, there are indications of a stuttering Indian economy. There have been a slew of revisions of India's growth rate. Moody's has lowered India's growth rate to 7% for the financial year ending March 2025. And the revision was from 8.2% in FY24. FICCI too reduced India's GDP forecast to 6.45% from the earlier projection of 7%. Asian Development Bank revised the forecast to 6.5%, citing lower industrial growth and weaker spending. India's second quarter growth slowed down to 5.4%, and RBI has also lowered India's economic growth projection to 6.6% from 7.2% for FY25. So at the moment, we are looking at a growth rate of about 6 to 6.5% for the financial year ending FY25. Clearly, this is one of the tougher budgets for Ms. Nirmala Sitharaman. Of course, post-pandemic budget was also a difficult one. However, this time around, the challenges are unique. So how bad is it really? What are the imperatives for the finance minister this budget? And the big question, is the slowdown here to stay? Well, to decode the Indian economy, joining me on the show is Aditi Nair of ICRA and Mr. D.K. Srivastav of EY India. Mr. Srivastav, to begin with you first, how bad is it really when when we look at the revisions that we've seen? Is it something that should be a cause of concern to us?
Well, there is no doubt that the real GDP growth in FY25 is estimated by the first advanced estimates released by the NSO. That is estimated at 6.4%, which is lower than the earlier expectations by the RBI and the IMF and so on. But what is really material for making the budget is not so much the real GDP growth as the nominal GDP growth, because it is the nominal GDP growth to which most of the fiscal aggregates are related, either in terms of tax revenues or in terms of expenditure GDP ratios and so on. Now, there the cause of concern is that for 2 years in running, that is FY24 and FY25, the nominal GDP growth has been 9.6% and 9.7%. Now, 9.7% in FY25 is substantially lower than the budgeted estimate for this nominal growth at 10.5%. So, the formulation of the budget as we go forward for FY26 will have to take into account the prospects of domestic growth, both real but particularly nominal, and also the reason as to why the Indian economy has slowed down. What was the factor that was not anticipated when earlier forecasts were made? And of course, the global economic scenario is changing very fast. The Indian rupee has come under pressure, and the likelihood of a new regime in the US will also change relative inter-country equations in a dramatic way, and all of those factors will then have to be taken into account in the formulation of the FY26 budget. So, out of all these considerations, we have to now consider what should be the growth rate, nominal GDP growth in FY26. What corrections can be done from here on? I think that would inform the making of the budget.
Right. We'll come into some of those points that you mentioned, Mr. Srivastav, a little later. Aditi, I want to bring you in here. Even ICRA has revised its growth projections for the year. So, how difficult is Ms. Sitharaman's job this time around in presenting the budget, and what according to you should be her priorities?
So, it's been a very interesting year. The economic survey had expected GDP growth to come in at 6.5 to 7%, and our forecast at ICRA is that we're going to be at 6.5%, which is just a shade higher than the NSO's advanced estimate of 6.4% that they had put out recently. Now, the advanced estimate is put out on the basis of data for a limited number of months, and when we are at the cusp of a change, sometimes it can end up being a little bit of an underestimate, which is what we're anticipating will be the case this year. Q1, of course, we had the elections which were underway, which had curtailed capital expenditure. And we also had a heat wave in North India, which really did have an impact on retail footfalls and on some particular sectors. Then we went into Q2, where the budget got presented and we kicked off with a solid capital expenditure in the month of July. But very soon after that, we got heavy rainfall. And again, that had an impact on sectors like mining, electricity, capex, and retail footfalls again. Coming to Q3, when we look at the high frequency indicators, we have our own in house ICRA Business Activity Monitor, which is a compendium of 16 high frequency volume indicators. And that is actually showing that a volume growth stepped up between Q2 and Q3 on a YOY basis. So we're looking at 100 basis points higher growth in Q3 as compared to Q2. So that's a positive. We also have data on government fisc for October, November. And both for the center and for the 24 states for which data is available, we're looking at a revenue expenditure growth, which is quite high at around 20-21%. However, capex growth still remained very sluggish at about 1% for Government of India and 2% for the states. Overall, I would expect that Q2 was a bottom. Q3 is going to be better. Q4, initially the trends are quite mixed, but we're in the midst of this global uncertainty that Mr. Srivastava was also talking about. And that is something that we now have to bring into our forecast for next year. Full year, this year and next year, we're looking at a real GDP growth of 6.5%. And for FY26, we're looking at a nominal GDP growth of around 10%.
Right. So, we speak about global uncertainty, and that's a factor that all countries are grappling with. But I want to understand in terms of our domestic policies. And Aditi listed out beautifully. Every quarter there were certain issues. There were weather issues. There were elections, and so on. Mr. Shrivastava, when you look at the economy right now, how worrying is a slowdown in consumption for you? And what are the factors that you will attribute this slowdown in consumption to?
Well, there is some concern about consumption expenditure. But if you look at the first advanced estimates, the private final consumption expenditure uh, is shown to be growing at 7.3%, which is an improvement over the previous year's growth of 4%. So, private final consumption expenditure, although urban component of that is a cause of concern, but overall that is not the real reason as far as the demand side is concerned. Demand side actual concern emanates from gross fixed capital formation growth, where actually it has fallen from 9% in FY24 to 6.4% in FY25. That is the real cause of concern. So I would add behind that is of course this languishing of government of India's own capital expenditure growth. So their infrastructure uh, growth plan, or capital expenditure growth. So capital expenditure itself was planned to at the magnitude of 11.1 lakh crore, and what they have actually achieved after 8 months is still only about 46% of that target. That slowdown is that contraction, in fact, is the real reason. Now we expect that there would be a lot of catching up done in the remaining 4 months, but our guess is that they will still fall well short of the that target of 11.1 lakh crore. Suppose they come even up to 90%, there would be still a major shortfall. And therefore, the real GDP growth at 6.5%, I think, would be considered to be quite robust. In some sense, that is not so much a cause of concern. My concern, again, I would reiterate, is about the slowing down of the nominal GDP growth. So the real GDP growth may be 6.4%, or may even be 6.5% if last year's numbers are revised downwards. But nominal GDP growth, I do not think there may be much revision. And if that is at 9.7%, then we have to then take a call on whether there would be an impact on Government of India's gross tax revenues and net tax revenues and fiscal deficit. In fact, then we have to go into the fiscal aggregates. So it is really the relationship between nominal GDP levels and the buoyancies that we associate with that in order to derive the budget aggregates. That would inform both FY25 RE and FY26 BE.
Okay. Is there a case, Aditi, in this budget to directly boost consumption? Do you think that's something that the government needs to consider? And beyond the minor tax breaks that we are hearing about, is there need to, give an impetus to the middle class through this budget? Because as Mr. Srivastava has pointed out, that consumption is hurting on all levels. We talk about rural consumption looking robust, but it's only relative, right, to urban consumption.
So, Shweta, I definitely agree. Consumption is extremely uneven. I think there are pockets where we still have healthy consumption, particularly at the top of the urban pyramid. Rural farm sentiment, I think, may improve on a steady basis now because we've had a reasonable Kharif harvest. Rabi sowing is on track, and our reservoir levels are quite abundant in most regions, which gives us a good amount of insurance going ahead into the next monsoon season. In case we have a slight delay or not a very healthy onset of the monsoon season, this is something which will keep us in good stead. So hopefully rural farm demand is going to be a little steadier now, over the next few months. On the capex side, the way we are looking at it, we think that the shortfall as compared to the budget estimate will be to the tune of 1.4 trillion. And that is still going to need more than 20% expansion in capex between December and March of this year. Similarly, for the state governments, our sense is that the undershoot on capex could be to the tune of 1 trillion as compared to their budget estimates. And again, that will still require a 20% growth in capex between December and March. So, if we actually achieve these truncated numbers that I'm talking about, we'll still get a pretty solid push to government. Fixed capital formation from government spending in the last quarter, particularly. So let's see how that pans out. For next year, my sense is that we could be able to target government of India capital expenditure of around 11 trillion. That will be about a 12 to 13% growth over the number that we think will get achieved this year. And on the consumption side, in terms of a tax break, see, one of the metrics on which India doesn't fare very well as compared to many of our global peers is that our income tax base has traditionally been on the smaller side. It has grown in the last decade or decade and a half with a lot of policy thrust, compliance, vigilance, etc. And we really don't want to lose out on the taxpayers that we've recently gotten entering into our overall tax base. So I think we need to be very careful. The first of all, not too much of a revenue loss coming in from tax concessions, and secondly, we don't want there to be too much of a loss in terms of the number of taxpayers going ahead.
All right. Mr. Srivastav, Aditi made the point about capital expenditure and how that's crucial in generating a feel-good factor also in the economy. Let's look at the three big challenges that this budget will have to address. I want to get your thoughts in on jobs. That seems to be the number one, focal point, actually, not only for the budget, but even if you see Delhi elections today, I got a call from with a recorded message from a political party promising jobs for Shikshit Berozgar. So that is the fundamental point. How severe is the problem according to you, and can the budget really address that? So we've spoken about slowdown in capital expenditure of the government spending going down, but private capex has not picked up either. Companies are not investing as aggressively as one would have liked. So we've been betting on a manufacturing story, giving it a push, but still progress has been fairly I would say below par. I mean, besides a few sectors that we've seen that have done very well, but there are several others that could have done better. So how can this budget really address these discrepancies, and secondly, or is the budget the right platform to address these issues, and this is more of a long term journey where India will have to keep working on its policies?
Well, no doubt it is a long-term journey, but budget does have an impact on the employment profile of the country, both at the macro level and at the micro level. At the macro level, of course, it is driven by the real GDP growth that we achieve and its sectoral profile. But at the micro level, you would recall that last year's budget actually spelled out a number of schemes, employment-related schemes
Yeah,
by
yeah.
Government of India. In fact, there were 5 schemes, very detailed schemes, and so on. But whatever information that we have on the implementation of those schemes appears that they have not really taken off so far, and we have to therefore question whether those schemes would be continued in the form that was proposed or in some modified form, or whether the Government of India would come up with some
Hmm.
new employment schemes. But as far as the macro link is concerned, it is the level of growth and its sectoral profile in terms of employment intensive sector growth, particularly manufacturing, that will have to be ensured. So budget can do something about the real GDP growth through this route about capital expenditure that Aditi talked about. That, in my view, is the only engine of growth that has been firing for the Indian economy, as far as the domestic part is concerned.
Absolutely.
And that fire was kind of
Yeah.
uh, slowed down or sputtered in the
Hmm.
fiscal year FY25, and knowing fully well that that is the only engine that would drive growth and therefore employment, that seems very inexplicable as to this deficiency in the capital expenditure growth. So as far as employment is concerned, I would say that government has both macro and micro linkages, and it has to not only propose schemes but also implement them effectively. But there is one related link or fiscal implication of this capital expenditure slowdown, which is that if there is not much of a deficiency in tax revenue growth, which can also
Hmm.
fall, but in our estimate that may not be substantial. And if the expenditure is not fully met, there may be a shortfall in fiscal deficit in FY25 revised estimates. And therefore, fiscal consolidation would be better. That might create a situation in which interest rate may go down, and
Hmm.
therefore the monetary policy side, there may be some accommodation, and maybe in the forthcoming year we may look at a 50 basis points rate reduction in the policy rate, and that might stimulate private investment and therefore help growth and employment.
Okay, let me bring in Aditi here. Aditi, what's your forecast on the fiscal deficit for FY25 and going forward? And then I want both of you to weigh in on whether India needs to, open up its purse strings a little bit and maybe go slow on fiscal consolidation.
Sure. So, Shweta, for the current year, we are looking at revenues broadly being on track and a 1.1 trillion shortfall in total expenditure, led by 1.4 trillion shortfall in capital expenditure. With nominal GDP now being lower than what the budget had originally penciled in, on balance, we still expect that the fiscal deficit will undershoot at 4.8% of GDP instead of the budgeted 4.9% of GDP. So broadly, that's the fiscal math for FY25. For FY26, we believe that with a 10% nominal GDP growth, the government could target a 10.5% growth in its tax revenues. And if we still think that with an 11 trillion capital expenditure and a 5.5 to 6% revenue expenditure growth, the government of India should be able to bring the fiscal deficit down to 4.5% of GDP. Now, the medium-term fiscal consolidation had said 4.5% or below. I think, excuse me, the below can be avoided. 4.5% would be appropriate in my view at the current juncture. For every 10 basis points of higher fiscal deficit, we can incur a additional expenditure of about 35,000 crore. But my sense is that in the current scheme of things, it's better to at least have a fiscal consolidation, stick to about 4.5% of GDP. And if tax revenues end up being better than targeted over the course of the year, then certainly we can channelize that towards higher expenditure.
Okay, now to get both of your thoughts in on whether the government should be so stern about the fiscal consolidation path, or now is the time to spend big and push growth. Mr. Srivastav.
But my view, my estimates also more or less agree with what Aditi has now said. 4.8% for FY25, and I think 4.4% for FY26. But after that, the real challenge would come in the medium term because of the likely pressure FY27 onwards with the revision of pensions and salaries, with the implementation of the 8th Pay Commission. And at that point, there would be a real bump up in the fiscal deficit once again. And in my view, any postponement of the commitment towards fiscal consolidation to the FRBM targets would be self defeating in the medium to long term, in the sense that the more the government drafts from the available borrowing space, the less would be the space available for private borrowing, the less would be the scope for the RBI to reduce the policy rate, and therefore we would kind of remain revolving around this kind of vicious circle. We have to make a consolidated effort, concerted effort to reduce the fiscal deficit. In fact, even for Government of India, it will not be okay, because if, as long as we maintain a very high level of government debt to GDP, interest payment to revenue receipts will remain high, and the scope for expanding primary expenditure would not be there. And so we have to take a medium to long term view, keeping in view the Viksit Bharat target, and we have to make a concerted effort to bring government's draft on available investable savings. So we have to take a careful view of the impact of the pay and salary revisions and pension revisions FY27 onwards, for streamlining our medium-term growth prospects.
Okay, Aditi, your thoughts?
Quite similar, Shweta. We have the Finance Commission report, which will be due later in this calendar year. Then we have the Pay Commission report, which will be coming out shortly after that. I'm not sure this is the right time to get into any kind of multi-year commitment via, a multi-year welfare program or, expanding entitlements at this point in time. CapEx, 11 trillion is a lot. Let's see it getting achieved before we put more money towards that. So I think this would be a good year to at least show that we've been able to stick to the earlier medium-term fiscal consolidation path which had been laid out. And then, of course, we got the hint that we'll be moving to a debt to GDP path going forward. So we're very keen to see the contours of that.
Okay, all right. Okay, very quickly, one quick wish from the budget. Something that you'd like to say to the finance minister, Mr. Srivastav.
Well, I would like to see some rationalization and reduction in the effective tax burden in the personal income tax space. I find that the corporate tax is performing much worse than the personal income tax. The buoyancy associated with personal income tax is nearly double that of the corporate income tax. I think some relief on that account and additional disposable income in the hands of the households particularly lower income and lower middle income, would boost consumption, and that would be another route through which we can support growth.
Okay, Aditi?
Well, I'm really looking forward to seeing details of the new medium-term path that the government of India puts out. So we hope that it's going to be quite well articulated in this budget.
So Aditi's beyond tax rate cuts. Aditi's like, kuch bhi ho, doesn't matter. I'm good.
Yes.
Well, I'm with you, Mr. Srivastav, on this. I do think that, there needs to be further rationalization of tax rates and easier compliance. Thank you so much for putting the Indian economy into perspective. Aditi is, more optimistic. She said that the fourth quarter is third and fourth quarter are not going to be as bad as the second quarter that we saw. Things are only going to get better. However, that optimism is tempered with a lot of caution because we have a new president that's going to be taking oath in the United States just in a few hours from now. And, whatever happens in the United States has an impact across the board, and India is not. And in a globalized world, of course, India has a lot at stake where the US is concerned, and specifically on the trade aspect. So, thank you very much for joining us, and a big thank you to all our viewers also for tuning in. Mr. Srivastav and Aditi, we will, of course, reach out to you after the budget to get your
Thank
take
you.
on, how you thought Ms. Sitaraman did with the first full budget of the third term of the Modi government. I think that in itself is so significant. Thanks so much for watching.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.